So now that the Diablo 4 is out for everybody, not just people that bought the deluxe edition, which was overly expensive, I thought that I would take another crack at my beginner's video because I already had a beginner's guide in the beta and a lot of that information still remains relevant. So we're gonna kind of just talk about the game in broad strokes, just so that you can kind of understand the consensus of what the game is, what you're going to be getting yourself into, and what the end game will possibly end up being for you. First and foremost, you got to create a character. I already have a beginner's guide on most of these classes, but to give a quick summary, the Barb is going to end up being tanky as well as brutal offense, but most of all, you have insane survivability, really good mobility skills that allow you to phase through enemies and stuff. The Necromancer, which is my personal favorite, has blood magic, bone magic, and more specifically summons, which the summons they're okay. They're not as good as the bone magic and blood magic currently, but hopefully that'll change over time. The Sorcerer is going to focus on 3 different elements, which is Frost, Pyro, and Shock, and then you can kind of just blend between all of those. You'll end up having abilities that'll either end up outright freezing enemies or setting them on fire for dots, you know, stuff like that. The Rogue has basically 2 options of either being a marksman or dagger focused character. The traps are kind of something that's always going to end up being in between and really good for crowd control. Most of all, you end up using your daggers to kind of build up a combo so that you can then unleash hell with your arrows. And then the Druid is going to end up being the class that can be kind of, I guess I would say it's kind of like a spell sword. So you have a lot of magic, but you can also get up close and personal with enemies. And one thing that I did want to mention, because lots of people are always very confused about it, is that you do kind of get units that you can end up summoning, which do kind of round out the character once you get to those points, because otherwise it's just Earth Storm, and then you can transform into a Werebear for dealing with massive groups of enemies and being tanky, or a Werewolf for being super duper quick and applying a poison damage over time effect. So I've hopped on my Necromancer just so I can end up kind of explaining things as we go along. Basically, you will probably want to rush the main story as soon as possible, just because around the halfway point when you're over in the desert biome is when you will start to get your hands on your mount. And the cool thing about this game is that once you end up getting your mount on one character, it actually will automatically start unlocked by default on every subsequent character. The other thing too is that the main story will also carry over as well. So essentially, if you have one character beat the main campaign, every other character afterwards will have the option of being able to skip the story entirely and focus straight up on the post-game content. Looking here at the map, there's going to end up being various things that you gotta keep an eye out for. These are going to end up being your waypoints or fast travel points. You want to make sure that you get them, because if you don't end up getting them, you're gonna have to manually travel to that area afterwards. This is going to end up being an altar of Lilith. They don't show up on the map, but they'll give you passive stats if you ever end up seeing them. And then sometimes you'll see these dungeons, which will essentially end up giving you a legendary aspect. So as you can see right here, this is actually going to end up giving me a special ability for my Necromancer only, whereas this one is going to end up being for the Rogue only. And the aspect is quite literally going to end up being on legendary gear. You can see each time one of your summoning minions damages an enemy, blah 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 blah. That's an aspect. And any of the aspects that you unlock is going to end up going into this category, because you can essentially take a piece of yellow gear that you find out in the world, and then you will be able to apply the aspect to that piece of gear. Now, you can also rip an aspect off of a piece of gear that you already have, but you'll only be able to do that once. You know, essentially, if you end up imprinting that aspect onto a new piece of gear because it's either got a lot more damage or a lot more armor than your current piece, well, then if you end up finding an upgrade later on, then yeah, you're not going to be able to take advantage of it. Now, there is going to end up being salvaging gear for materials for crafting and so on and so forth. Very important. It'll also end up unlocking different transmogs for you, and then otherwise you can just go to one of the vendors and just sell items for gold outright. But generally speaking, it's not really something that you're going to be struggling with too much. Like gold, you'll end up getting like by exploring and doing other things. There's also going to end up being the Curiosity merchant, which is basically the gambling merchant. So when you're out in the open world, sometimes you'll end up seeing this little yellow icon that'll pop up depending on where you are. Not this up here that's something different. And essentially that's going to be a world event. So other players will be able to see that world event and be able to take part in it with you. Usually every time I've found them, I've done it alone, but that's also because I've been playing before the standard edition came out. But you'll end up getting the Autos, which is a limited resource that you can only store a limited amount, but this is going to carry over to all of your different characters, and essentially you can use it on the gambling merchant for a chance of getting legendary gear of your choosing. There's going to be a PvP merchant and resource, but this is something that comes into play a little bit later in the game, around level 50 or something like that. And then your gold. All of this is account bound. Just wanted to let you know about that. There's also going to end up being all these different tabs that you'll notice. So consumables are going to end up being various potions that you'll end up finding out in the world. Some of them later on are going to be able to apply a nightmare effect to a dungeon, which this is going to end up being kind of the end game thing, where you'll apply this to a dungeon, which makes the dungeon significantly more difficult at the cost of, you know, obviously giving you more rewards and stuff. A quest tab for quest resources, aspect tab right there. You can end up sorting your items as well. Now, depending on your character, you will be able to not only see all of your different materials and stats, but you can also check all of the items that you have in your storage here. And then the main skill tree is going to end up being pretty straightforward. I kind of have videos that talk about this already, but generally speaking, you'll have to invest a certain amount of skill points in one aspect of the skill tree before you unlock the next part of the skill tree. And you don't have to invest, like, let's say, oh, I want to end up unlocking my Corpse and Macabre skills, just on my Necromancer, for example. And it says that I need to invest a certain amount of skill points in order to get to this part in the tree. Well, I don't have to invest any skills into my core skills if I don't want to. I could just invest it in all my basic skills and still end up unlocking this. So that's where the variation in class builds ends up coming into play, because maybe you have all of your abilities just taken up with your core skills and you've ignored everything else that's, you know, later on in the skill tree in favor of giving yourself different passives and so on and so forth. Now, once you end up getting to level 50, that's when the Paragon levels open up. And I'll end up having another video that'll talk about this in more detail. But essentially what happens is you'll end up starting at this node. And as you end up leveling up past level 50, you'll see we get 1, 2, 3 different Paragon points for every level past level 50, which essentially we can just put onto any of these slots. We have to do it in a linear order, so I can't unlock this slot because I've got this slot, but I could easily just start regressing my points back to the beginning. But the point is that this will end up giving you different passives, and then eventually when we get to the glyph socket, that's where all of these bad boys are going to come into play. So these are items that you'll end up finding out in the world and also just find as rare drops from other areas in the game, depending on your world tier and difficulty, as well as your character level, depends which ones you'll end up finding. But you'll see right here, so this one, radius size 3, next radius increase is at level 15, so level 15 in the Paragon level, and essentially it's showing that you know, what would happen is I would put this down here, and then any of the connected nodes would essentially end up giving it different passive buffs. So you can see required purchased in the radius range. So this would be the additional bonus right there. If requirements are met, is I would have to have 40 intelligence out of all of these nodes, while this would have to be a large enough radius to end up interacting with all of those and being like, oh, you have this much intelligence, you know. But you can see that later on we'll end up going into the other Paragon areas, which I'm obviously not at yet, but it gets a little bit more complicated and a lot crazier. Now, all the characters are going to end up having something like this as well. The Barbarian has weapon mastery, so you'll basically end up getting more proficient with certain weapons as you use them. Sorcerer will be able to end up changing different abilities. Necromancer can change your different units and stuff. And, you know, I don't really want to get into too much detail about it, but just saying that that's kind of the other aspect of the game that adds that much needed layer of complexity on top of the Paragon levels and then the skill tree itself. Now, another thing that you'll see out in the open world is sometimes you'll end up seeing weird icons with a timer slowly going down. That's going to end up being either a world boss or a Legion event, which is, you know, a big event that pretty much everybody on the server is being notified of. They'll end up giving you really, really good rewards. I wouldn't recommend that you go to them unless you are the recommended level. Speaking of recommended level, this game will actually scale all of the enemies to your level. So I could essentially be playing with my friend who's level 1, and I'm still going to get appropriate loot and appropriate difficulty while I'm helping them get through the game. Now, the only difference is that the world tier is going to be affected by the host. So the world tier at any time can end up being changed, but you'll see right here that the average player from level 1 to 50 is going to either be adventurer or veteran, which is tier 1 or 2. And tier 3, you have to unlock around... You can get around like level 45 or something like that, maybe a little bit sooner, but it's basically going to require you to go through the Cathedral of Light dungeon, which is very, very difficult. It's kind of like a damage check and a defense check, basically making sure that you can handle the level 50 to 70 enemies. And if you can complete that dungeon, you'll be able to unlock this. But, you know, obviously you end up getting much, much better drops, including sacred and unique drops. So what that basically means is that sometimes I could end up getting a piece of gear like this right here, you can see is a sacred legendary chest. So this all sacred means is it's just going to be an affix that is applied to an item that essentially means that it is a stronger variation than all of the other gear from the lower difficulties. That's all. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's automatically going to end up being an instant upgrade for you, but in this case, for this chest, I didn't get lucky and get a sacred legendary drop. I actually got a yellow drop that was sacred, and then I ripped my aspect off of my current legendary chest and forced it onto this one, which means that I'll never be able to upgrade this if I want to end up keeping that legendary aspect, right? So that's the incentive of going out and doing the dungeons and so on and so forth. Now, moving on to the post game. So once you end up getting through the campaign, or more specifically, once you get to around like level 45 or something like that, you'll start to notice some stuff opening up. More specifically, once you beat the main campaign, the Tree of Whispers is going to pop up, and this will essentially allow you to do all of these random generated events that are timed, as you can see, for Grim Favor. So if I go here and I complete this, it's going to give me 1 Grim Favor, and you can see down here at the bottom of my screen, I've got 1 out of a total of 10 Grim Favor. You can only carry 10 Grim Favor at a time. It doesn't overlap, so you want to be careful and pick and choose your battles, because you don't want to be like, oh, you only need 1 Grim Favor left. Why would you go and do the one event that gives you 3 Grim Favors, you know? They are going to end up spawning in multiple different biomes, and then any of the red biomes that you'll see is also going to give you Grim Favor, but this is going to be an open PvP area. So you gotta be a little bit careful on that. We'll talk more on that in a little bit. But essentially, by getting enough Grim Favor, you would end up going over to the Tree of Whispers, and you can exchange all that Grim Favor for your chance of getting a cache of whatever the tree decides, whether it be a 2-handed weapon, a greaves, chest plate, whatever. And you have really high odds of getting a legendary out of that. You can also end up getting Paragon glyphs out of it as well. That's where I ended up getting these 2, was just the Tree of Spirits or whatever. But then, yeah, moving on, there's also going to end up being the PvP ones. So these are going to end up giving you Grim Favor, and essentially the way that the PvP area is going to work is while you're here, you'll kill enemies to gather various, you know, a currency, right? Which is, what do they call it? The red dust. And essentially there's going to end up being these wells that you'll bring all of the red dust to purify it. And once it's purified, it ends up going into your inventory permanently, and then you can use it to purchase various items from the PvP merchants, which is just cosmetics near as I can tell. But there is going to end up being a gambling NPC that only deals in the PvP currency. So I don't know if that's better odds of getting legendaries, or maybe you get unique legendaries out of it that affect PvP. I don't know. But point is that in these red biomes, if you see other players while you're trying to deposit your red dust into the well, they will be able to come and wreck your day. I've been fortunate enough to never even run into another player, but I think that that's going to change after the standard edition releases. Well, I'm recording this before standard edition released, or should I say I'm recording this before going into this biome since the standard edition was released. Now, another thing too, you'll notice all these little blue things. These are going to end up being your world quests. You only have a limited amount of space for world quests, so I'd recommend that you basically just want to complete the world quests in the area that you're currently exploring and then just dump the rest, because you'll be able to always pick those quests up back again anyways. However, some of the quests will actually be tied to items that you might just randomly find out in the world, and you'll probably want to end up completing those before, you know, moving on or just getting rid of them and stuff. So another thing to mention about PvP is that Helltides will show up every now and then, and as you can see, this one is announced to everybody on the server and is basically saying fight other players, complete activities, and collect aberrant. It's basically going to end up being kind of the same as doing the other activities within the PvP biome, but this one is going to be a lot more aggressive because you'll get a lot more rewards out of it. So yeah, you might want to have a good PvP build, but there is going to end up being creatures in the biome as well that you can take advantage of. You can grief other players while they're in the middle of fighting them, or more specifically, you'll be able to get temporary buffs that might make you resistant to players, but less resistance to mobs. And so it's kind of like a nice little blend and a little bit of strategy thrown in there, right? Lastly, I do want to mention that there are these Grim Favor rewards that'll pop up. In my experience, these dungeons last way too long for the amount of Grim Favors that they give. Like, I could literally complete all these Grim Favors in the biome before I would be able to complete this dungeon. And that's not just because I'm going through it really slow. It's just that the dungeons just take way too long. However, you do end up getting an aspect out of it, so maybe that's the incentive and worthwhile. And then lastly, as you end up, you know, going through the world and completing all those and junk like that, you will end up getting these items from Legion events and whatever else. You know, you can just end up getting these all over the place. But essentially, this is going to end up turning a dungeon into a nightmare dungeon, and that's going to end up being kind of the big end game. I know I kind of mentioned it briefly before, but I'm just saying that that's kind of the big end game content, because when you end up going into those dungeons, they'll give you some of the best items in the game. You can see this Fallen Temple, for example, it's already level 70 plus. And then speaking of a world event, there's this one right here. So unfortunately, this world event is something that I can't actually complete because we have to have completed Core Dragon first. And last but not least, which I probably should have mentioned earlier, is that if you ever see any of these priority quests, you should probably do them right away, because they are literally going to be the tutorial quests that are showing you, hey, here's a bunch of stuff that you can end up unlocking. Anyways, hopefully that ended up covering everything you wanted to know. If there's anything that you think that I needed to add in addition, you can leave a comment down below. I'll try my best to answer, or somebody will in the comments. Generally speaking, there is still a lot to this game, you know, like fortification, overcharge, and everything like that. But I don't really feel like that's stuff that should be addressed in a beginner's guide. More so, this is just give you a broad, you know, the broad strokes of what you can expect out of this game, because you're going to be going out, grinding dungeons, grinding mobs, getting loot and stuff like that. And essentially, you're just going to keep repeating that at higher difficulties. Now, the cool thing is that as you do get into the higher difficulties, you'll not only be able to see sacred gear, unique gear, and stuff like that, but there are a limited amount of legendary aspects that will generate in the earlier difficulties. So as you end up progressing and going further into the game, you'll actually start to see different legendary gear that you wouldn't have seen prior that can completely end up changing your build. Honestly speaking, I love this game so far. I've just been having an absolute blast. Every time I hop on, I think I'm gonna be on it for a little while. Next thing you know, 5 or 6 hours have passed and I haven't eaten. But it's an amazing game. I'd say stay away from all the naysayers that are just trying to hate on this game because, oh, it's popular to hate on Blizzard, because so far they've done a fantastic job with this and have rectified all of the issues that they ended up doing with Diablo Immortal, which Diablo Immortal was a mobile game, you know. In my opinion, I think that Diablo Immortal had to walk so that Diablo 4 could run, because there are a lot of mechanics that are lifted from Diablo Immortal, but they're all the best ones in terms of it being an MMO and open world and all that stuff. But anyways, that's my 2 cents towards it. If you enjoyed today's video and actually managed to get all the way through it, I would appreciate if you would smash like stuff for more. You can buy the merch if you want to support the channel, and otherwise have yourselves a wonderful day, everybody. Sayonara and stay epic.